episode today of Out of the Darkness. I'm your host Angela, and I hope you enjoy the upcoming episode. Today we're going to have a look at a compilation of various paranormal stories. So sit back, relax, and get ready to hear some creepy tales. Just down the road from where a few years ago I'd previously lived in southeast Australia is the opening into about 100 acres of woodlands and bush that I frequently went into when I was younger to do the usual things, riding and camping, etc. I was out driving at around 11:30 one night with my girlfriend, and as we were in the area I decided to show her the woodlands. She loved everything to do with nature, and it was summer, so an extremely warm night. I left my car with the lights on shining into the trees, as we weren't going too far in, and it was pitch black. The two of us just sort of sat chatting, having a smoke and generally relaxing. She was sitting on some sort of map of the area that had been put onto plastic, and I was keeping an eye on the trees, so I had a feeling something was just wrong. I've read on here that a few people have said they felt they were in danger, although nothing around them was off. It was this same feeling. Every sense was almost reaching out, and my adrenaline was up there. There wasn't anything I could see that seemed any different. After lighting another cigarette to calm my nerves, I scanned the tree line again and realised it looked different. After staring into the dark, I saw that there was moonlight now lighting up grass where it couldn't have before, as there had been a black shape blocking it, which I thought was a tree. I get goosebumps just typing this, but the only way to describe it was all sound ceased. Everything went dead silent, and a few seconds later, this disgusting feeling of dread fell over me, and I saw motion in the dark as this thing crawled towards us on all fours. I've seen nearly every animal in the outback here, and we don't have large predators like in the US or Europe, but somehow I knew this was a predator, and it wasn't hiding itself from us, just kind of crawling slowly towards us. I don't know if my girlfriend saw it, as I couldn't look away. Just as it reached the line where my car lights were able to illuminate it, it reared back on two legs and just sat staring at us. Now, I'm 6'4", and this thing was about another metre larger than me, with arms that were far too long that reached down near the ground, and all I could make out was an off-white, almost yellowish fur on it, and in the dim light I could make out the silhouette of its head, like a dog or wolf. I wasn't able to move as it stared at me, but it was at this point my girlfriend gasped, which seemed to break whatever was stopping me from thinking logically. I grabbed her by the arm and sprinted to the car, slamming the doors, and tore out of there as fast as I could. Both of us too scared to speak until about a half an hour later. We've both discussed it many times, and the feeling that we had was what I imagined a rabbit sees when it catches a wolf or fox looking at it. This is something that would be able to end us with absolute ease if it so chose. Neither of us have been able to come up with an explanation for what it was, but it has definitely changed the way I view the woods and bush, and when I go camping or hiking now, I think back to that and wonder what it was, and if I will ever see anything like it again. I grew up in the Appalachian Mountains, completely rural. I lived in a valley community, and my house was surrounded by forestry and mountains. When I was about 14, my dad started to hear strange sounds coming from the hills behind our house, knocking sounds, as if something was hitting a tree, and the occasional inhuman yell. My dog, a rough and tough outside boy, was very drawn to those hills at random times. His ears would shoot up, and he'd quickly run up to the forest and stay for a while. Him going up in the hills wasn't uncommon, but at the time he started acting particularly suspicious about them. And don't worry, nothing bad happens to him in this story. Anyway, the noises started to become more frequent. My brother and his friend used to hunt up in the hills, and they heard the noises too. Much louder, of course. One day the noises wouldn't stop. They progressed, louder and louder, and there was growling. My brother was pretty much sick of it by now, and wanted to know what the fuck was up there after about a year of wandering. It's evening time, about to get dark, so he takes a flashlight and a shotgun and heads up the hills. He sees a creature that looked like what he said could be a Sasquatch. It was tall, broad shoulders, wider than its torso. He more so saw its silhouette because of the darkness. He chased it off and came back to the house. He told me what happened and drew a sketch of what it looked like. The noises had stopped after that day. They never came back. A couple of weeks later, a new Bigfoot special came out on TV. A witness sketch of an alleged Bigfoot looked almost identical to the one my brother made. To this day, we're still convinced Bigfoot or something lived out there. My dad named him Sassy, short for Sasquatch. In college, I lived up on top of a mountain road, still only 5 minutes to town down a trail through the woods. There was 100-plus-year-old oak in the yard, slab stone porch built by hand. I lived in the studio apartment outside of the main house. The main house was haunted, but my shack was cozy. The woods up there were weird too. I never really was in the main house at all, but the three who lived there said some nights you couldn't sleep for all the noise. Floorboards creaking, thumping, knocking, etc. My experiences, however, happened outside. Like I said, I hunted small game up there, as there must have been a rabbit colony in the vicinity, plus a few squirrel drays. Often out there I was stalking. I'd get the distinct feeling of being stalked myself. Keep in mind this stand of forest is only several acres, but was preserved mainly because of the historic oak trees scattered around. It's old woods. I would hear laughter, like children's laughter, but not quite like in a creepy movie. It was a bit distorted and almost like flirty giggles you might imagine a fairy would make. It would come from a different direction each time I sought it. I eventually decided to stop following it and hunt. It never did stop. I would sometimes spend an afternoon in town having drinks or hanging at my friend's place. I'd finally leave and have enough liquid courage to hike back up the trail in the dark. That laughter would be replaced by noise, just like things running around you and dashing in the trees. I've been an outdoorsman for a long time, and I know the woods are noisy at night, particularly in the southern Appalachians. But this is different. It was dead silent out there in that stand at night, except for this rushing to and fro by some unseen feet. Not like game fleeing, though. Deer run away and crash about doing it. These steps were like something or things running swiftly around me. It's like it would cross the trail up ahead, then behind me, then alongside, but I could never see anything. I was a big nighttime owl back then, and was regularly up doing schoolwork at 3 or 4 a.m. One such night it had just snowed a fresh 20 inches or so, decent accumulation for the area. Our yard and the woods were like a paradise for me and my dog. I was excited to hunt around the next day for tracks and see if I could locate the rabbit den precisely. I was up working, and the dog came scratching to get in. Not frantic or anything, but I let her in and she lay down to sleep. It's odd because she's a husky and preferred the snow to my tiny heated apartment every time. I decided to call it a night as well and went for a cigarette. It was about 3:24 a.m. I can still see it on top of my MacBook display before I closed it. I went out and noted the clouds were dispersed a bit and the moon was bright on the snow. I lit my cigarette and was just looking out across the fence and into the woods when something caught my eye. It looked like a silhouette of somebody leaning against one of those oak trees, like you'd see somebody with a palm planted against a wall with the arm straight out leaning. It's not moving, so I can't tell if I'm just tired or the light is funny or something. So I walked further to the end of the porch, and as soon as I stepped on the fresh snow, it took off. The thing was tall. My estimates based on that tree put it at about 7 foot. It ran along the border of the fence and back off into the woods. It was hairless as far as I could tell, and naked. Otherwise, though, its form was just that of a skinny, tall man. I went inside and switched to boots, grabbed my rifle and flashlight and went to check the tracks. I picked up a set of what had to be a size 14 or 15 bare feet tracks. It ran along the fence and down the treeless stretch of backyard as if heading into the woods. Then the tracks just ended, about 20 feet short of the wood line. I don't know if it jumped to the tree line. Probably could have, but there weren't any more tracks that I could find that night or the next day. It was like it just vanished. Never could explain that one. Last year I received a doll from my aunt. It was a hand-me-down that she found in storage, so I don't know its origin story or where it came from. Her name is Alice, and the first weird note is that I immediately knew her name. As soon as I held her, I felt her name was Alice. Anyways, originally Alice sat in my room, but one day while cleaning, I put her in my closet. After putting her in my closet, weird stuff started happening. I would hear her in the closet, usually knocking against the walls. It was so loud that my friend could hear it over the phone. I would get recurring dreams of someone named the Medicine Girl, and I would wake up from these dreams in sleep paralysis. My other objects and items would go missing randomly, only to be found in places I hadn't left them. My grandma's stuffed bear, that is at least 50 years old, would move across the room and end up in places I hadn't put it. I do practice witchcraft, and the plant on my altar died. All of this stopped when I moved her out of the closet and back into my room. Due to all of this, I believe that she is haunted. However, I can't find anything online about what you're supposed to do with a haunted doll, and I'd like some advice. I believe that she is scared of being alone or doesn't like being hidden. Hence, everything stopped when I removed her from the closet. Any advice would be appreciated. I'm not going to provide exact locations for this, as this happened on the trail that my mum and I walked the dog on every day for 10 years. As such, it was pretty close to our house. I lived in a rural part of the PNW, and so there were a lot of trails just outside of town that bordered on a lot of forest. This was one of those, but it was probably the biggest trail in my town. It was actually an access road to some stuff, so it was like 10 feet wide and gravel. At the time I briefly went missing, I was about 10 years old and had walked that trail every single day. My mum was with me, as was our dog. I'd been warned not to go off the trail and wouldn't have normally, but there was a small sub-trail that had a rope swing over a creek. I loved to play there as a kid, and that day I crossed the creek to hang out on the other side while my mum talked to a friend she had run into. I was within sight of my mum, clear view across the creek, when all of a sudden it was like things swelled. My surroundings were completely unfamiliar, and there were plants that shouldn't have been there, the wrong kind of trees, with the leaves at slightly the wrong point for the season. Of course, I knew what to do if I got lost. I hugged a tree and shouted for Mum. I was probably 300 yards away at absolute most, but probably under 100. She should have heard me, but she didn't. I wasn't there for very long before our dog came and got me. He wasn't a very smart dog. With all love, saying he was as dumb as a bag of rocks would have been an insult to rocks. He also didn't like me nearly as much as he liked my mum, and would have stayed near her. But he calmly walked up to me, nuzzled my hand so he was on his head, and walked me back out to the creek where I could see my mum. I thought I'd been gone for 15 minutes or so. Apparently it was an hour plus, and multiple people were looking for me, including directly walking on the path I had never left. While working in a Western Australian mine, I lose 3 hours. We have heaps of little side tracks and entrances to disused areas that, when not in use, are blocked off by 3 road cones to prevent access. While travelling to a pit after a break, I noticed an intersection where the 3 cones were protruding a few metres onto the road. I remember thinking whoever put them in such a ridiculous spot must have been an idiot, and pulled over got out and moved each cone back into position, the entire task taking perhaps 15 seconds. I returned to the vehicle and proceeded on my way to the pit to find someone else was operating the machine I had been assigned to. I was really surprised because I thought I'd been the first light vehicle to leave towards the pit and did not see anyone pass me while I repositioned those cones. I got on my two-way and called him up to ask what was going on. I joked that he must be lost and he was in the wrong machine. I was then informed they have been looking for me for over 3 hours. They were right too. I estimate I stopped at about 5:45 to move the cones, and when I entered the pit it was just after 9. I don't have an idea about where that time went, but I did feel off like motion sickness for a few days afterwards. These are a collection of my experiences revolving around and on the Blue Ridge Parkway. From the summer of 2002 until early 2004, I lived in a small town outside of Asheville, North Carolina. There wasn't much to do in the area on Friday and Saturday nights, other than hanging out with friends at the movies, bar or pool hall, or in our case, the scenic overlooks of the Blue Ridge Parkway. My group of friends' go-to meeting spot was one of two overlooks. We would jump on the Blue Ridge Parkway off of the Tunnel Road and drive about 3 miles north to the Haw Creek Overlook, park our cars and, depending on the weather, sit outside and just talk the night away. It may sound boring, but those nights were some of the best of my life, filled with laughter and pure joy. It's where we went to decompress from our early 20s stress-filled days. We would usually meet up there any time between 9 and 11 and not depart until well past 2 a.m, often ending our nights at the nearby Waffle House. Depending on the time of year, the Overlook would get busy with other groups of friends doing the same. Romantic dates or even nature enthusiasts camping out in their cars or returning or embarking on hikes. On certain occasions, Haw Creek Overlook would be too crowded for our liking, so we would proceed to the next overlook, Tanbark Ridge. That was almost always nearly empty. It was in these areas that my friends and I experienced truly paranormal and possibly demonic experiences. Certain nights there could be as many as 6 of us hanging out on the overlook, and other nights only 2. On one particular night, and the first Blue Ridge Parkway experience that I can recall, we were standing and talking near the back of my car while we smoked a cigarette. We were facing the road. We were the only car at the second overlook. When we weren't talking with each other, it would get quieter than quiet up there. The whole night we kept hearing what sounded like conversations or voices coming from the other side of the mountain across from where we were gathered. It wasn't uncommon for night hikers or campers in the area, but these voices were not coming from an area that was known for trails or camping. As we were standing near the back of my car, we all heard the voices, louder than before this time. At first it was from our left, then immediately from our right, and then finally straight in front of us. The voices, although rather loud, were inaudible. We couldn't make out what they were saying, almost like gibberish or a made-up language. We were all expecting to see someone by how close in proximity the voices were, but there was no one around. No car had even passed the overlook for a while. We wrote it off as having to be hikers conversing somewhere on the mountain and their voices somehow carrying or projecting through the woods. For weeks after, we told the story to other friends or co-workers whom would also share their similar accounts with us. That was the start of many more strange and sinister occurrences. Simultaneously with the strange events that I experienced, my family and I were also experiencing paranormal activity at the house we were renting, but I wondered at the time if the occurrences were related in any way, which, as time went on and more events happened, I didn't think they were connected at all. The night, I believe, triggered a string of events, which was a Saturday night after work. Before heading to the first overlook, I stopped and picked up my friend and we proceeded to get on the Blue Ridge Parkway. About halfway up from the entrance and the first overlook, we noticed a pickup truck, 3/4 of the way into the woods off of the road, with only its interior light on, a man returning to the truck with a shovel in his hand. My friend and I instantly got creeped out by this peculiar sight, and half-jokingly both said that the guy was probably hiding a body. Later that night when we were leaving, as I drove by that exact spot where we had seen the truck, I nearly drove off the road as my interior light in my car turned on and nearly blinded me. It's quite dark up there, no lights at all, and almost gave me a heart attack at the same time. The light went on for maybe a second or two and then shut off. I'm generally a level-headed person, but at that moment I was shaken. My friend was equally shaken as we both calmed ourselves down. When we got to his house, we sat in his driveway and tried to make sense of it. That light had never once turned on for any reason before that. After I dropped off my friend, I had to drive under the BRP bridge on my way home. As I passed under, my light turned on again, and this time it flickered a few times and then stayed off. In my opinion, this was now past the point of coincidence. That was not the last time that my light went off in my truck for a span of a few months. Not every time, but almost the light would come on or flicker near that spot on the BRP where we saw the man and his truck. One of my friends who was driving behind me one night saw the light go off from her car, and it scared her so bad she did not return to the BRP at night. On one night, 3 of us gathered at the first overlook. It had rained a lot the day before, and that morning. On the opposite side of the overlook there was a sheer rock wall that ascended about 100 feet. There was enough moonlight that night to see the water trickling down the rock wall. It was my friend that was riding with me when we saw the man that noticed the water coming down the rock wall appeared to resemble a person's head tilted sideways. I agreed, and so did our other friend, but as more water ran down, it looked like it formed a rope around the person's neck. As more time went on, and more water, the person resembled a girl. It was almost too clear, like someone purposely created this effect. We started concocting ideas about perhaps that man did do something bad in those woods, and maybe the light flickering and the water on the rocks was a calling of sorts. I had disabled the light in my truck from going off. It still went off a handful of times after that, which should have been impossible. But the cherry on top of it all was the night that I was the last one of my friends to leave. As I drove down to leave the BRP, again, near the spot, my front driver's tyre blew out. I pulled over on the shoulder of the road and tried to call one of my friends, but didn't have cell reception. If it wasn't that I had to be at work that morning, I probably would have slept in my car until there was light. That was not an option. I proceeded to get out and change my tyre in the pitch-black night. I felt so vulnerable, and although nothing happened, I felt as if I wasn't alone. I felt that at any moment something, I don't know what, would occur to scare the living shit out of me, but nothing did, until I got back in my car and started pulling back onto the road. At that moment, my light flickered again, and I swear I instantly felt my right side of my body get 30 degrees colder. The next day, my friend and I called in anonymously to the police department and reported what we had seen in the woods, the truck and the man, but did not mention any of the paranormal events that had occurred. We felt as if we had to say something, but for the longest time we weren't sure how or what to do. We hadn't heard of any disappearances in that area, but then again in my early 20s I wasn't an avid reader of the paper or watch much of the local news. These events all happened around spring to late fall. We stuck to the bars and pole halls for months after those events, until early the following year. We finally decided to venture back to the BRP more frequently. My friend and I, the same friend, were starting a band, and the BRP was a great place to collaborate and write songs. One night, and my last night ever spent there, we took up an acoustic guitar to help finish writing a song. That night both overlooks were crowded, so we drove to this little cut-off right off the road just past the first overlook. We settled there and propped open the tailgate. We were up there for a couple of hours, probably around 1 or 2 a.m. at this point, when we started hearing straight-up laughing coming from the woods. We stopped what we were doing and froze, listening. The laughing stopped, and we heard what sounded like a hoarse snarl followed by a whisper, a laugh again, and finally a psst. We immediately closed the tailgate, jumped in the car and drove down to the first overlook. At this point there were no other cars there. I pulled into the overlook with my car still facing the road. We had no idea what those sounds that we had just heard came from. It didn't make any sense. At the overlook my friend got out of the car, and we both lit a cigarette and decided to head back to the car as it started raining slightly. Just before we got back to the car, we heard what sounded like a gallop, or horse hooves getting louder from the area we'd just left. Had a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, and an overwhelming feeling to just get the fuck out of there, and so did my friend. Without saying anything to each other, we ran and jumped into my car to leave. As I turned over the key and started the car, I happened to look back, and that's when I saw an image that to this day I will never forget. I saw what looked like a tall goat-like man, and distinctly saw horns as it started running full speed towards the car. I didn't look back again and drove like a bat out of hell from that area. My friend didn't look back, but he heard the galloping get louder and shut his eyes. Neither one of us returned to that area at night ever again. I moved away in 2004. My friend still lives in the area, however to this day he does not go up to the BRP at night, only visits during the day. When we get together, we can't help but talk about all of the shit we saw and experienced during that time. We always talk about one day returning to the area at night, even though we were scared to death. The curiosity of the unknown draws me, and we both have questioned why those things occurred to us. My dad told this to me recently, and I felt the need to share. When my dad was little, he used to spend a lot of time at his grandmother's. She lived up in the mountains, and she was one of those people who just took care of everyone. He said he lost count of all the times drunks or druggies would come in all hours of the night, and she would feed them, let them rest, and send them on their way. She was a kind person, but also one who what you see is what you get. She wasn't afraid to tell you what was on her mind. He said he grew up not being scared of much because of her, and he thought the world of her. But there was one event that happened to him in the woods that scares him to this day. He was about 17 or 18, and he had stayed with his grandmother so he could go deer hunting the next morning. The next day he gets up early and heads out. My dad has a good sense of direction, but for some reason that next day he got turned around and lost in the dense forest of the mountains. He walked and walked and walked, and night fell with him still clueless on where he was. Tired, frustrated, and a little uneasy, he stopped to take a break and sat down. But it was pitch dark, his little flashlight not giving off much light. He was thirsty and starving, and he just wanted to get back to his grandmother's. As he sat there thinking where to go, he heard very heavy footsteps and twigs snapping behind him. This scared him at first, thinking he may have come across a bear. He stood up, knowing if it was, he needed to get out of there, but not be hasty about it, as if to spook it. He just starts calmly walking away, hoping he was going in the right direction this time. But the footsteps followed him. They were extremely heavy, thudding behind him in the distance as he walked. He noticed that they were speeding up. My dad starts walking faster, and as you can guess, the footsteps became faster. In a short time he hears them, now maybe a couple of yards behind him. Scared shitless, he turns around and shines his flashlight to see nothing but these huge hoof prints in their wake. The grass and such were dead and dying with each step. He starts freaking out and straight out sprinting, not caring which way he's going. He just wants as far away from whatever this is as possible. The footsteps behind him are following suit, sprinting after him. He only glances back once more, still seeing nothing but giant hoof prints and dead grass, leaves and such wherever they landed. By now, he's not sure how long or how far he'd been running when he sees lights in the distance. He runs towards them, hoping that someone can help him if he's come upon a house or a store. He breaks out of the woods and joy floods over him when he sees it is his grandmother's house. She is sitting on her porch. The lights outside are on. His grandmother was a religious woman, so she was reading the Bible at this time. As embarrassing as it was for him to admit, he said he started screaming for her, tears rolling down his cheeks. And she stands up, looks behind him to see the hoof prints and hear the sounds for herself. She holds her hands out to him, and he grasps onto them tightly as she pulls him towards her. She then says loudly, "You can't have him." He said the silence that lingered after that was intense. He had buried his head into her shoulder, so when he looks up, all he can see is where the hoof prints and dead grass and leaves lay. She just held on to him as he cried, whispering to him that he was okay and it was gone now. He has no idea what was after him that night, and he doesn't want to know, but he is pretty sure his grandmother saved his life that night. So it's 6 a.m. right now, and I really couldn't sleep after this. I first woke up at midnight, raised my head a bit, looked towards the door to realise that I can hear a really creepy voice of someone singing, which, just by the sound of it, I could definitely tell it was a doll. I was so tired, so I didn't really realise what was happening. The TV was on in the other room, so in my head I thought it might have been coming from there. In my really tired state, I just told myself, if I had to own a doll, I'd shit myself right now, and went back to sleep. Then I woke up at 2 a.m, and I hear the same creepy singing again. The TV was turned off this time, and honestly, the more awake I was getting, the more I was questioning what was actually happening. I realised I was not imagining it, so I've been sat here for 4 hours now thinking about how real this felt. I even googled it in the hope that it had happened to someone else. I'm so creeped out right now, just thinking about that moment. I just know it was there in the other room. I feel like I know what it looks like, even though I never even saw it. Has anyone else experienced this? We hope you enjoyed today's episode of Out of the Darkness, and everyone here at DNA Paranormal Services would like to thank you for joining us. Remember to follow us if you haven't already so you don't miss out on any future episodes, and share us with your friends if they enjoy the paranormal as well. If you have any paranormal experiences you'd like to share with us, you can find our contact details in the notes section of this podcast. We'd like to thank you again for joining us, and until next time everybody, stay safe.